Folks, welcome to the Q&A. It's Dr. James and Dr. Mike. What's going on, my man?
James, not only am I ready for Q&A, I'm ready for T&A.
Oh, I'm always ready for some TNA.
It's an excellent website called TNA Flicks. I would recommend people look it up. It's full of adult content.
TNA Flicks. Very nice. Well, I have to admit, I am still buzzing. I don't know if you caught UFC 261 this last weekend, but that was a banger from the prelims all the way to the end. I hadn't been like that amped about a sporting event for a long time.
Yeah, it was intense. Shevchenko, Bullet Valentina, her performance was one of the most dominant ever against a challenger. It was insane. It was like, why are we here? What is going on?
It looked like just like when a newbie shows up to like a practice and you just completely maul them. Just like it just was just like, oh damn. And it was funny too, because like that was the one area they thought Andrade was going to have the maybe not the upper hand, but the maybe a tactical advantage was the grappling, and Valentina was just like, I'm just going to beat you at this just so everyone knows I'm the fucking queen of this division.
That's intense. Great game theory move. Like sports strategy move of just like, because literally in her interview, Andrade was like, we were literally preparing only for a stand-up fight, and this was like really shocking. And it's kind of like, yeah, even if your ground game is good, if you just weren't preparing for it at all, it's kind of like, what? It's a shock.
And then you had the opposite problem with Masvidal and Usman, where Masvidal was just waiting for the takedown so much he neglected the striking, right, and then just took a straight one down the middle and bang, out.
It was intense. Actually, just not in a level of everyone else.
Oh, no. Well, I thought what was most impressive, did you catch the Namajunas fight?
Yeah.
Dude, the way she threw that kick where she was just posturing, it was like going to be that inside leg kick because Wei Li was really heavy on that front leg.
Yeah.
Rose shows inside leg kick. Wei Li steps back because she sees it coming, and then Rose just raises up and throws it up top and just smacks her.
I was like a question mark kick or whatever.
Yeah. No, she just hit. She just showed like low and went high. The question mark you usually kind of turn over and then flick it up.
I see.
Okay. Jared can do it. He can show you how to do that. It's really neat. But it was just one of those like like a millisecond thing. She makes a decision and just boom, knockout. That was like so impressive. It was,
Wei Li was real pissed.
I know.
I would call that a only mildly controversial stoppage because
really, I didn't think it was controversial.
Wei Li got fucking rocked, but as soon as the ref pulled apart her last hammer fist and pulled them apart, Wei Li literally just sprung right back up, and it was kind of like she was already on the way up, and it was like she wasn't really knocked out. Like people have been rocked that bad, and the ref lets them fucking go at it. But she did take a few undefended hammer fists to the face. And that's why I said only mildly. And when you say controversial, I would say that in a different universe, if they let it go, I could see Wei Li recovering completely, turtling up, repositioning, and the fight continuing. I think it was a very good judging call. Wei Li can't really be pissed about that, but it was like, did she knock her the fuck out completely? No.
But you don't have to be knocked out completely for it to get a TKO. That's the thing, right? So it's
totally.
Yeah, I'm still buzzing. That one was crazy. I also have some fun facts for PSA for dog owners. I had a whole bunch of weird shit happen lately. So I thought my dog, Hammerfest, had gotten marijuana toxicity because she was all wobbly and weird. And we took her to the emergency vet. And they were like, this is kind of what it seems like. She probably got into some marijuana. And it turns out my doggy daycare lady had the same thing happen to her dog like 2 weeks ago. So I was like, okay, she probably got into whatever doggy daycare lady had at her house, and she's going to have, this marijuana toxicity, and it makes it look like they're drunk and they can't move, and they're just uncoordinated, and they can't walk, they can't go to the bathroom. It's just the whole thing. Yeah, it's sad. So they gave her like the treatment, and they said keep an eye on her and see what happens. She doesn't get better for like this. Today ends up being the fourth day. She's still like all fucked up. So we go to the vet again, different vet, their normal vet. Turns out she had a tick. She had tick paralysis. And if it goes on for a long time, it can actually cause them to stop breathing and die. So, folks, if you have a drunk, wobbly dog, be aware tick paralysis is a thing. And that's my bad because I think we probably missed one of her flea and tick medication dates in, it happens. And she's so fluffy, I couldn't see a tick anywhere. So if you have a dog and they look like they're drunk, be aware of ticks. Yikes.
Did they find the tick?
They did. And they tested her blood and everything, and she's otherwise healthy. And they said, yep, tick paralysis. And they said at our vet, they said, it happens maybe like 2 times a year at the most. They even took a video for educational purposes and asked for permission.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because it's rare. But yeah, it was a little bit of a scare there. So hopefully
Is she getting better now?
She's still sleeping. She should be better within 24 hours once they remove the tick, and then they give like an because the tick releases like a neurotoxin, so it has to clear. So they give you like a little bit of medicine, and usually within 24 hours they bounce back. So right now she's taking a nap. Yeah, crazy, right?
Fuck.
Yeah. So make sure you get your dogs their tick medicine.
Yeah. All right. Questions?
Let's do it.
First up is...
Oh, sorry. I just realized when I pulled it up. So we had that. There was like 100 comments about the Keck thing, right? Remember last week we were like, what's up with the KEK? So like a ton of people commented on that. And I just want to jump on this because normally this would be my wheelhouse, right? So it's a World of Warcraft thing. And I'm sure people are like, James's nerdy ass should have known that. Well, I played all the Warcraft games except for World of Warcraft, and this is going to be contentious for you fucking Warcraft people, but I played EverQuest 2 and D&D Online. Those were my MMORPGs. I never got into WoW, so that's why I went over my head, missed it.
Yep.
So I felt like I needed to address that because people jumped on that. Apparently, that was the most upvoted one, and a couple other people made the same comment.
Yeah, that's went over my head. That's for goddamn sure. All right. First up is Cade Howell's first question.
Ooh, he's got two high rollers.
Yeah, but we're not going to answer the second one because we have a whole video series on that on RP. He says, what's the difference between progressing through a mesocycle conservatively over the course of 5 to 6 weeks versus a shorter 3 to 4 week mesocycle with more aggressive load / rep progressions? Are beginners best off training conservatively in terms of proximity to failure, whereas advanced folks need to be a bit more on the aggressive side? I would say no. So 2 things. One is at the end of the day, progressions need to be decided in as much of an auto-regulated manner as possible. So if you're hitting the RIR and at or just above the reps that you need, your weight progression is good. If it's too easy and you're hitting too many reps and you don't want to add that many reps, then you need to progress faster in load. If you are progressing so fast in load that you can't hang on to your RIRs or even your reps at all, then you're progressing too fast. There, volume progression, same idea. Like you can say, if I'm not getting any pumps or any soreness or whatever, I probably should add volume, and there's not really a whole lot of wiggle room on that. And if you're like just barely recovering from like your Monday workout to your Thursday one, and you get a Mondo cycle pumps and super crazy everything, then adding any volume there is just a real stupid idea that doesn't make any goddamn sense. Now, within those autoregular progressions of relative effort and volume, there is wiggle room. There is wiggle room. What we would say is if you're on a maintenance phase or not changing body weight, then the middle of that range is best. If you're in a massing phase, start out conservatively, but it's okay, especially later towards the end of the meso, to get a little bit aggressive within reason, still within the autoregulated paradigm, because on massing, pushing forward and ahead is really good and your body can take it. And on cutting, I would recommend going on the lower 1/3 of that algorithm. And if you guys have the hypertrophy book, the scientific principles of hypertrophy training, we actually have a whole chart about how you should be adding sets in RIR. And there's pluses and minuses in there. It's like add 1 to 2 sets. Right. So you would like add 1 set if you were cutting, add 2 sets if you were massing, something like that. It's not a strict rule, but like you can go a little bit more aggressive when you're massing. You can always go conservative, and there's pretty much no downside of that. But if you want to go a little bit aggressive on massing is cool, on cutting is probably not a good idea. And that's probably how I would see that. And beginner advanced, I think beginners, they should be progressing. Actually, we've had multiple videos on this, and it's in the book, should progress only on technique and not on actually anything else. So if your technique is stellar, you progress. If your technique is not stellar, you do not progress. It doesn't matter how fucking aggressive, not aggressive, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the deal with that, I think.
Yeah, really good, thorough answer there. And just to kind of reiterate something that Mike is saying, like you make these decisions based off needs, right? You don't just make them arbitrarily and say, well, I'm going to take a moderate progression and on this one. The reality is, it's like, how long do you need to go for in order to hit whatever landmarks that you're hitting? So in the case of beginners, you're mostly focusing on making sure they have good technique, maybe increasing some load as they have demonstrated excellent technique over time. And that might allow them to train, like a 10-week mesocycle. It's very feasible that is going to happen. Whereas somebody who is more intermediate probably is not going to do that. Now, is that just something as cut and dry as like, okay, well, training age dictates the length? No, it just happens to coincide with those things that are as a result of your training age, in terms of how strong you are, your recovery needs, your volume landmark needs, etc. So again, like, the reason why Mike says these things are individualized, not auto-regulated, is because you don't just have a one-size-fits-all approach to things like progressions and mesocycle lengths. It's something that you always address on the individual basis, and sometimes don't make sense. You might have individuals who fall outside of kind of the norm in terms of their training age and their needs. So you always take it on the individual level.
Yep. Next up, just scroll down, is Henrik Anderson, our good friend.
Hold on, this guy's talking shit about me over here. Ever hear of a comb or a hat? Rocky Evans, I'm assuming you're a man, and a man who is concerned about another man combing their hair needs to get a job or a career and focus on something else. There you go.
Masturbate more or less.
Have some ambitions other than criticizing my hair.
All right. Henrik Anderson says, does calorie distribution matter as long as the macronutrient distribution is good? For example, I consume about 25 to 30% of my calories in the first 2 to 3 meals of the day for adherence reasons, while I consume the rest of my calories in the remaining 2 meals. This is both for training and rest days. I train in the evening, so the calories are clustered on my workouts. According to Henselman's, muscle protein synthesis does not need carbs and or fats to be stimulated. That I would disagree with that.
That's questionable there.
Total caloric yield of a meal absolutely has an effect on how much muscle you're going to be growing out of that meal. You just eat a meal of pure protein and you're in a deficit, almost all that protein just gets burned up for energy. It's nothing stimulated at all. Therefore, as long as I distribute protein evenly, doesn't matter. Yes. Are any gains left on the table if I distribute my calories as explained? No, because your distribution doesn't seem to be insane. And I think that you can make up a lot of muscle growth you didn't have earlier in the day by having more of it. And as long as your protein is distributed fairly even, you're good to go. I just wouldn't do anything crazy super pulsatile, like if you had like 20% or 15 or 10% of all of your calories total in the first half of the day or the first 3 quarters, and you had one big ass meal at the end. I think that's probably like slightly suboptimal. People try to do shit like that. And also training in the evening and then having a shitload of food before you go to bed. There's some pretty decent research amounting now that circadian rhythm wise, that's not the greatest idea. Might not lead to as much recovery, good sleep, muscle building, and fat loss as potentially having at least 50-50 split of food AM, PM, maybe not anything more than like 40 AM, 60 PM at most. In most cases, and even better to have maybe 60% in the morning, 50% or 40% at night. I think that's probably a little better. And it says, does your answer change if I was in a calorie deficit? In a calorie deficit, it's less of a problem because you don't eat so much that it interferes much with your sleep in the evening. And actually that can be an advantage because you're nice and well serotonined out and you can get some good rest if you eat a lot before you sleep. So in a calorie deficit, your method is not as big of a trade-off as if you did it all the time. But I would say that trying to move to a little bit more of an even distribution is probably going to be a slight benefit in your case, unless you're in a deficit, and then I think it all probably washes out. James?
Yeah, and in this case, and this is like a question of like kind of optimality versus practicality. And in this case, like he prefaces this question by saying, I do this for adherence reasons. So I think like doing an imperfect program consistently very often will, outweigh doing a perfect program that you can't do consistently. So in this case, like even if you don't have the optimal spread, if this is something that allows you to do it in a way that you can do consistently and then make changes that have impacts down the road, I think that's perfectly fine. Like, could you maybe have a slightly different spread? Sure. But if it's too much fuss for you to maintain it on a daily basis, then it's not worth your time. So I think it's fine. I don't think it's a huge deal. I am curious about, I know what Menno is kind of getting at in terms of like, you can just have protein and that does stimulate protein synthesis, but that is like a very narrow scope of that issue. That it does seem to be potentiated by carbohydrate intake and some other things. So, but yeah, getting back to that, I think it's fine. The only thing I would say is like if you're in a deficit and then you find that like the spacing in between your meals starts to become increasingly, painful for you, then you might consider changing it up. But if you can do it, keep going.
Yep. Next up is Jeremy Bata.
All right.
Bata. Hey guys, quick question. When tracking progress/performance, you, in parentheses, Mike.
just to make sure that I'm excluded from the question.
Yes. Often say to try to beat the reps from the previous week. Do you think it really matters if I try to beat total rep, average reps per set, or beat the reps on every set compared to the previous week? This is a great question that actually has a very easy answer. The average is absolutely the correct answer, because you can have some sets where you underperform, some sets where you overperform. But if the same number of sets was done and the average number of repetitions at the same load is higher, or the repetitions are the same but the load is higher, or some combination of the two, you're fucking golden. Now, I don't want to say that the answer is total rep. It can be total rep if the same number of sets are done, but then the total rep and the average give you the exact same parameter. If you just say total rep, that's a bad deal, because you could actually be getting weaker over time, just adding more and more sets to make up for the fact that you're weaker. You sure as hell get a similar amount of stimulus each time, but then you can no longer use your progression system for tracking. It's just that application of stimulus. So you could be like, oh man, I used to be able to get this in 10 reps and now I'm doing it in sets of 5. Like, that's not good. That's not good. You need to deload way before that happens. So that's why total rep isn't the best answer. Average reps is. Beat the reps on every set is not required, because some sets are good, some sets are bad. I would say the goal should be to beat the reps like by 1 on every set. But if you have a bad set, one set, and then you can make it up for it on the next one, that's totally that's totally cool. I think, James.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And actually, I just had a client who this was their first time doing a mass after like a really long time of like progressive weight loss, right? So it was like very exciting. Like, okay, it's mass time, right? And this person, no surprise, was making like really, really rapid gains in strength. And so it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to gauge RIR. And one of the problems that they ran into was they had this like hard line goal to beat reps on every set, every single exercise, every single session. And what ended up happening was this person like prematurely overreached on several exercises as a result of like having to recalibrate with the new gains that they were making and having this hard set rule of like beat every time. So like, it's kind of like a soft goal, right? It's not a hard goal. Like, yeah, if you can beat every time while still within the constraints of your RIR, that's great. But if you're just dead set on beating reps every time and throwing RIR out the window and things like that, then you're going to set yourself up for these unfortunate kind of overreaching situations. So, I think it's an okay soft rule. It's just as long as you don't take it as a hard rule of like always have to win, because then at some point you're going to hit a plateau and then you start going down, right? At some point there's nowhere else to go.
I saw a really great movie recently called Hard Rules.
Oh, was that on TNA Flicks?
Maybe. What if it was?
Much better than the first one, Soft Rules.
Ooh, that's an interesting one.
It was a frustrating one.
Tough to film. All right. Next up is a little scroll down, Forrest Nash Fitness.
On the way down here, Michael Concepcion says we need to watch Neon Genesis. Motherfucker, who do you think you're talking to? Who do you think you're talking to? Of course I've seen Neon Genesis. That one blew me away. For those of you who haven't watched it, it's an anime, but it's like a really deep one. And so you watch the show, right? And it's like, wow, that was crazy. And you have to kind of think on it for a minute. And then you watch the movie, which is meant to wrap up the show. And it's just, it's bananas. I'm hoping to watch the remake. They just released the last of the remake films in Japan. So hoping to see them. What was the guy's name? Forrest something?
Forrest Nash Fitness. There he is. Hey, docs. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for all that you do. I've been following recommendations for the past year plus, and doing so has absolutely revolutionized my training and the way I coach my clients. Very cool, Forrest. Our pleasure.
Awesome. Glad to hear.
My question is about loading ranges for the SLDL and good morning. I have been training for years, but only started doing these exercises properly last year. I'm relatively tall, 6'1", weighing 185 centimeters. I have long femurs relative to my torso. Perhaps is because
welcome to my world.
Yeah, not my world. Shit. That's the opposite of my world. Perhaps it is because of my anthropometry, but I find that I can get very sore from SLDLs and GMs with very light weights. For example, 3 sets of 10 to 15 with 35 kilograms of the good morning gets me sore for 2 to 3 days. Feel a lot of tension in my hamstrings and deep painful stretch during each set, but because the weight is so light, I feel like I never truly get close to failure and have the sensation that I can always do more. Do one more rep. However, when I've tried increasing the weight significantly to get close to failure, I tend to feel it less on my hamstrings and more on my lower back. I know that my muscle connection isn't everything, but it does seem like SFR on these experiences is better for me with lighter weights. Forrest, you're doing an amazing thing of answering your own questions.
Yep.
Using, and not a dig, this is a good thing.
Yep.
Using a perceived stretch/tension DOMs as a proxy for stimulus, and of course, lighter weight equals less fatigue. My current strategy is increasing the weights very gradually while continuing to practice technique, but I'm just wondering if my lack of proximity to failure in the meantime is a problem, and if so, what should I do about it? Many thanks in advance for your advice that you can provide for us. You are doing absolutely the right thing. Please continue to train in exactly the training range you have, and add 5 to 10 pounds every now and again to it. And eventually that lightweight will be pretty heavy, but never give up the technique that lets you hit your hamstrings and get them nice and sore with very few sets, because then you're absolutely doing the right thing. This is where one of those like tension is everything, and you got to do progressive, and my muscle is for fucking pieces of shit, and insert, homosexuality reference here kind of thing. Like, people say shit like that, and then you watch them do something and you're like, so you feel that in your hands? You're like, oh no, man, I feel it everywhere. Like, sweet, you're a fucking idiot. So if you're fucking getting reliable exercise after exercise, session after session, week after week, month after month soreness doing something, man, 99 problems with stimulus is not one of them. On the other hand, if you're using real big weights and you're like, I don't really know if my hamstrings are doing anything, my back is tired, that's really just much more of the wrong answer. If you came at us with a completely different question and you said, hey guys, like, I normally train heavy, but I feel it mostly in my back, and I don't really know what's going on with my hams, but sometime I try light and it feels amazing, but I don't want to give up heavy, it would be more difficult for us to try to convince you to stop going heavy. But you're already doing the right thing. So rock on, James.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dr. Mike here. You are on the right track. Now, I will say that the good morning, I think, is a really good illustration of this problem, where I feel like with the SLDL, it's kind of, with that one, as long as you are conscious of your back posture, there's not much room for fudging it outside of just rounding your back and doing a shitty SLDL. But if you're conscious of that, either you can pick it up or you kind of can't. Whereas with the good morning, I feel you on that. You can kind of schmig around a little bit more and just kind of oof it up with your back, and
bend your knees a little.
Yeah, bend your knees a little, and kind of, there's a lot more opportunities for those types of errors. So the good news here is that you are working in a range which is getting you sore, right? And hitting the muscle that you're trying to target. What I would say is, since you are relatively new to these exercises, so we could effectively call you, not to be condescending in any way, but we say you're a beginner on these movements, which is fine. What you will find is that the supporting musculature will start to build up as well over time. So what you will find is that for now, you're doing sets of 10 to 15 before you really start feeling it in your back. Well, at some point, your back, your glutes, and all these other muscles are going to start getting stronger just as a result of you doing that particular movement. And then what you'll find is that they stop being as much of a limiting factor or as much of a contributing factor in this case, when you are doing the movement, just because you're just building up everything that goes into that SLDL or that good morning. And what you'll find is that sooner or later, you won't feel like you have to oof it up with your back or as much anymore. And you'll probably start moving into heavier weights as you have trained this movement, we'll say for maybe 2 or more years. And what you'll find is that you might actually start getting better SFR, maybe in the 5 to 10 rep range, which is maybe more kind of common for those faster twitch muscles like the hamstrings. And you might be able to use those heavier weights and maybe only need to do like 1 or 2 sets of, let's say, 6 to 8 reps on an SLDL, and then you're done. So like, for example, like, I don't know about you, Dr. Mike, I can speak for myself, but if I did a set of 15 on good mornings or SLDLs, I might die. There's a chance of death at that point. It just won't, It just doesn't work. And that's
my
just
lower back would prevent me from continuing before I could do that. So for me, the heavier weights are actually better.
Yeah. And my hamstrings would be so utterly destroyed that I would not be able to train hamstrings for probably a month. And I'm embellishing a little bit, but you get the idea. And as that's just a result of training age, right? In this case, where we've developed the muscles to do that. And actually the best SFR tends to be in a little bit in the heavier rep range. But what you are doing as a beginner is perfect, because you're using light weights, you're using good technique, and you're still getting a good stimulus on the target muscle. So keep doing what you're doing and kind of what I just reiterating what I said is over time, what you'll find is that you'll have less and less problems with other muscles interfering, like your lower back, for example. And you'll probably find that using those heavier weights actually ends up being better and better and better as you tolerate it with that same good technique.
Yep. Next up, Andrew Atkinson.
Let's see. There you are. Gotcha.
Superb. Hi, docs. What are your thoughts on only doing abs while cutting and none during massing, or doing all the time, and benefits or disadvantages to both? Right. Thanks.
Okay, look, the reason why I laughed, right? It's just funny because the first one, only doing abs while cutting. So like, there's kind of a conundrum with that thought process, right? Because when you're cutting, you're probably not going to be growing any substantial amount of muscle anyway. So then you would ask, like, why train abs at all at that point? And I think with the abs, more often than not, it's a question of, do you want to train abs to potentially make them bigger? If the answer is yes, probably some amount of abs all the time is a good idea. In terms of massing, whether or not the abs are a focal muscle group, like if you're doing any type of ab emphasis, that will determine how much that you're doing. Any other time is going to be essentially like a maintenance level amount of ab training. So, if you're cutting or if you're on maintenance, then it's just basically like an MV or slightly better for abs. The question is, like, do you want to train abs? And that kind of is the first funnel, right? Because you could just not train abs at all, and that's fine too.
Yep, agreed. There's a slight addendum to if you start training abs at the beginning of your cut. Just because they're so untrained, they might do some growth during the cut. Sure. You could have them pop out, and then you'll be nice. And then during the mass, you don't train them because you have better things to do than train abs. But and that's just if you get to the place at the end of your cut where your abs are big enough and you've been training them during the cut, then the answer is that's great. Try not training them during the cut and see if you still have awesome abs. You probably will. Most bodybuilders don't train abs at all. And they got ripped abs. I never fucking trained my abs, and I had a whole six pack and veins in it and everything, because the fat loss is really what causes ab stuff, unless you have really small abs and you want them bigger. And then if you really have small abs, you want them bigger, try really training them, like James said, through the mass and cut, and then you'll really get a chance to have much bigger abs, and then maybe you'll like that look better.
Yeah, you could make a case that like hitting an MV for abs, regardless of how frequently you train them throughout the year, is essentially just stepping into the weight room and training. Like, you might not actually have to do a lot of direct work to hit an MV for abs, assuming you're doing some kind of like maybe deadlifting, squatting, any of those types of movements. You just train your midsection so hard. I would have a hard time justifying specific ab work if you really just didn't want to train abs. So that's kind of why we said, like, just choose whether you want to do it or not.
Yep. All right. Next up is Zachary Fiesel. Is a red Z on my computer.
Got it.
Or, yep, magenta, whatever that is. Zachary says, you often talk that any individual's MV, MEV, MRV can be higher or lower than the volume landmarks. Do we know if MV, MEV, MRV are normally distributed?
wait a minute. Wait, I got to reread.
Yeah, no. He means
the volume landmarks.
They are the volume landmarks. He means as published in our various,
like our recommended ranges. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we're guesses as to where we think they are for most people. Do we know if they're normally distributed? We don't. I would bet all the money I have that they are, because complex biological traits, especially traits that intersect not only with genetics, which is already the highly pleiotropic, and then tons of lifestyle variables and everything, is almost all those end up being very, very normally distributed. So I bet everything I have that all of them are absolutely fucking normally distributed. And that's a good bet for almost every single biological trait, especially a trait that has relatively complex inputs, is just going to be fucking normally distributed. So yeah. So, which is to say, for those of you folks that aren't super big on statistics, that means that most people are within some general, 5 to 10 set plus or minus from what we recommended, and very few people are outliers. But the tails are pretty long, and then some people can have an MRV of like 50 sets for back per week, and they do everything right and everything RIR, and those people absolutely exist. So when some people say, like, man, volume landmarks are bullshit, I can do 50 sets, they just don't understand statistics and don't understand that they're an outlier. So when we say,
and they're probably not an outlier either.
Yeah, they're probably not an outlier, but they can be an outlier too. Right. And then there's also people that say, like, if you're doing more than 20 sets a week or anything, you don't know how to train. And it's like, no, that's probably true for most people, but not true for all people. So it's, I think that's the word on that. James, you got anything to add on that?
No, only what our former mentor used to say in that you're special, just like everyone else.
Just like everyone else. All right. Next up is Big C Sun.
Big C Sun. Got it.
Oh,
You better live up to that name, son.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hey, docs, thanks for all the great work you do. How do you go about measuring body fat percentage? I've used the Navy calculator as well as height to weight measurement chart, height to waist measurement chart. I'm just never positive if I'm actually getting a good point before bulk, because when looking at a picture of what 10% might look like, I can never tell if the people are flexing or not. They are. They always are. Just assume that from now on. Or not. So it's difficult to use the mirror. Okay, we'll resolve that in a sec. I know people store body fat differently as well. Yes, I'm 5'8", 140, 150, depending on leanness. I've often got waist measurement to around 29.5 to 30 inches. That doesn't mean much of anything because waists are hugely genetically determined. Some people just have bigger waists. Bill Kazmaier with 0% body fat will probably have a 45-inch waist just because he's fucking gigantic.
Don't start with the strongman shit. I get too pumped.
Yeah. Sorry. I could see abs slightly not flexed and pretty well flexed. So here's the thing. You don't have to get to 10% to start rebulking. You can start bulking from 15. You can even start it from 20. The only logical thing with bulking is this 3-point comparison. One, get as lean as you like to see yourself. And that's literally just up to you. Point two is don't get sloppy fat with shit hanging off your body. Okay. Like if you can't see your abs at all flexing, for most men, you're probably too fat, right? And you probably don't like to get that fat either. So that's another answer. And part three is make sure the difference between the first point and the second point gives a nice long, at least 16-week consecutive runway of good quality mass gaining so that you don't pick a point in which you're like, all right, well, the fattest I want to get is shredded with no veins. And the leanest I want to get is shredded with veins. And there's a 3-week period of massing between those two. And then I have to recut. Don't do that shit. So make sure a nice big difference between the two. And you can get as lean as very, very lean. If you have abs and veins, you'd be totally fine. You regain just fine as long as you don't have a weird food disorder eating and you're not waking up hungry in the middle of the night. Then there's no such thing as too lean. And then there's really no such thing as too fat unless you're sloppy and your health is bad. And number one is you don't like how you look. In a competitive bodybuilding way of answering this question, there's just one little proviso is don't get so out of shape that it makes your next diet very hard. So don't go above pretty decently clear abs when you flex. But for everyone else, those three things I just said, start where you like, where you think you're nice and lean, end where you like, where you're not too sloppy, and then anything in between, just make sure you have a nice long, at least 16-week consecutive runway with no mini cuts between the two, gaining at like 0.5% per week maximum, and then you're good to go, James.
Yeah, very good answer. Just to kind of specifically answer the first part, how do you go about measuring body fat percentage? Big C, we pretty much exclusively don't. And even with my clients, I used to entertain when they would go get, what's it called? The DEXA, but there's the other one. They like the in-body, not bod pod, like the in-body or whatever it is, the fucking BIA thing.
BIA, that sucks.
Yeah. Anyway, so what I have found, and my opinion has changed on this over the last couple of years, is that I tend to find that doing those actual body composition measurements, whether it's DEXA or pick and choose whichever one you want, I find that it does more harm than good. There's just riddled with so much error. Even if you do it under relatively consistent conditions, it still has like incredible amounts of variation and error between measurements. And it just causes people to go insane and make just totally outlandish decisions. So I think using the more subjective measures that Dr. Mike outlined in this case is actually better than what we would call the objective measures, which would be like getting a DEXA or skin folds or bod pod or BIA, any of those things. Normally, as scientists, we would say you want to lean more heavily on the objective, but at this point, they're just so not reliable, or actually we should say not accurate and not sufficiently reliable to make meaningful decisions, that I think the subjective is probably your best bet. And if you want to have a more objective measure, just use your body weight. And that seems to be just fine. So I know that sounds kind of antithetical to what a scientist would say, but we're just not there with the body composition measurements that you can do. So I don't waste your time. Mike and I don't do it outside of maybe just for shits and giggles. And we certainly don't require our clients to do it.
Yep. All right. Michael Chi. Purple M.
Ooh. I was thinking chi like,
Yeah.
internal energy chi, but
Goku type shit.
mhm.
All right, Michael Chi says, "Hi docs, I'm a few weeks into my meso, and while performance match/speed is still generally improving, I find myself systemically or mentally fatigued 2/3 through the workout, such that I just don't feel like pushing through with the last third of the session.
Oof.
For example, if I plan to do 6 exercises in the session, the first 4 great, but by the end of that, I'm ready to quit rather than finish up the last 2 exercises. Do you have any recommendations? Do you have recovery? Have you grind out, etc.? Grind it out, because if your performance isn't falling, then you're not actually, you're fatigued, but not fatigued enough to interfere with much of anything. So until your performance continues to be matched or beaten, you do not deload. When your performance becomes matched or beaten, you can do recovery half week or deload or whatever is best based on a variety of other questions we'd ask you for that scenario. So I would say grind along. Training's supposed to be hard. You're not always supposed to feel good about it. James?
Yeah, so I agree, and I will just add one more on that, is that if you have some flexibility in your training frequency per week, maybe consider adding another day, and that way you can have whatever those exercises that tend to get put on the back burner, they can have their own day where you're maybe not quite as fatigued, 2/3 of the way through the session. I know maybe you already have your frequency laid out in the most optimal way, and in that case, grind it out and maybe even consider removing some of those exercises if it's causing you to systemically like overreach prematurely. If not, as Mike said, like it's hard to justify doing fatigue management measures when your performance is going up or at least staying the same. So at that point, you just got to bite down and do it. What did David, our friend David, used to say? Ain't nothing to it but to do it.
All right. Next up is Brown B. Blair Monkman.
Got it.
Blair asks, can we have a breakdown of linear periodization, general benefits and disadvantages versus conjugate and DUP? So for that, I would refer you to an article that Greg Knuckles and I co-authored, actually 2 articles we co-authored for Juggernaut Training back in, I think, 2015, and they still hold true. I think the article is something, the title is like, there is only one kind of periodization. And so linearity and variation, which is what conjugate is, and DUP, which is conjugate is variation in either training systems or rep ranges or exercise goals. DUP is variation in volume and or intensity and or relative effort. These things all appear in a program. Every good program has an element of linearity. For example, if you have a conjugate program, which doesn't get harder over time, your program is fucking stupid. It doesn't work. So you could look at a conjugate program over several weeks or months and say, well, it's getting harder over time, kind of like in a line. Isn't that linear? But yes, it's correct, right? But also, if you linearly increase everything every session, then every single workout would have to be harder than the last, including workouts with unrelated muscle groups. That would be kind of insane. So pure linearity is really fucking stupid. Fatigue management alone makes that not a good idea. Variation makes it another not good idea. So every program has some conjugate elements to it, or some DUP elements to it, or basically variation of some sort, introduced to either upkeep various fitness quantities you don't want to decline, simultaneously push 2 fitness quantities in a known trade-off with each other, or manage fatigue. So every program is based as a linear idea of we're starting from worse and we're going better. And then because of the demands of variation and the benefits in it, the demands of keeping up certain qualities and the demands of fatigue management, you're going to have some what's called pulsatility in the program. It's going to go up and down, up and down. There's going to be some different exercises chosen, some different energy systems trained in various fractions. So then periodization is just actually called one thing now. It's just called modern periodization. It's what James and I were taught in school. We got literally our PhDs in this. And we don't say linear periodization versus conjugate or DUP. Linear periodization has some other problems with it. It's not really periodization, it's linear progression. That's just a mild, just real pedantic notion. But
no, it's more than that, actually. I mean, you nailed it on the head. So linear periodization is not a thing. Linear periodization is like the exercise science bastardization of modern periodization. This is where when you have exercise scientists looking at sports stuff in a lab and they have no fucking clue what sport training is.
Let's test it with undergrads that don't know how to lift.
Right, and that might sound like what am I trying to say? Like you're sport physiologist. What do you mean exercise physiologist? There's a big difference, right? If you say linear periodization to any sport physiologist, they're going to like shake their head at you and be like, there is no such thing as that. That is not a thing. Periodization is inherently nonlinear. what you are talking about is what Mike just said, which is like a linear progression, right? Which even in that case, like nothing can progress linearly indefinitely. So all forms of periodization and progression are inherently nonlinear. So it's just one of these weird things. I hate that it's just out there, and it's because you have, unfortunately, you have like people in exercise science and exercise physiology who dubbed the term, not really understanding what they're talking about. I mean, really what it comes down to is periodization is just the systematic sequencing of your training variables to meet some predetermined goal at some predetermined time. That's really what periodization boils down to in a nutshell. And it includes all of those elements of things that Mike already said, right? There's an inherent nonlinearity to it. There's auto-regulation, like there's pre-planning. There's all sorts of stuff that goes into it. It's just silly to think that like there's these different methods of periodization, when the reality is you just have like intelligent training that is meant to systematically get you to where you want to be in the timeline that you want to get there. That's periodization.
Yeah. Let me find, oh, here we go. A very related question, which we'll just answer now as well. Ronald Suarez, if you want to, you probably have to just type this in, James, because he's a little out of order there somewhere.
Ronald Suarez, very spicy. Oh, God damn it. Similar question.
So he says, for bodybuilding, to use any of the periodization models like block, linear, undulating, conjugate, are those more for performance athletes? So they are no longer. There's only modern periodization, which uses linear elements, block elements, undulations, and the attention to multiple fitness characteristics at the same time, which is conjugate. Like they used to be called different methods of periodization or methods, and that's really just not a thing. Because you go to Louis Simmons himself, and I say, what kind of periodization model you use? He's a conjugate, and you pull out his record of his lifting or whatever one of his lifters for the last 6 months, and it looks like on the exercises the weights are going up over time. Be like, it looks linear to me, Louis. He might not have anything to say about that. And you would go long and far in actual sport practice with strength and conditioning coaches that know things to find a purely linear model applied to an athlete. Like we'd add 5 pounds. We just always add 5 pounds, but no deloads, no sometimes out of regulation like that. None of that. You only train one fitness quality at a time. Like, yep, that's it. Just add 5 pounds, add 5 pounds. Like that's nonsense. And we're not going to justify that with calling it a model. I mean, that's a notion. It's literally a notion. It was an idea someone thought is true, but didn't put it properly to actually test. So So yes, we in bodybuilding use what's called modern periodization, and our entire book, Scientific Principles of Hypertrophy Training, literally explains that whole thing and how to apply it. So give that a shot, and I think you might really like it.
So I'm not trying to beat this horse dead, but like, again, if you ask this question to sports scientists, sport physiologists, you're going to get that same head shake. And we say like, there's no such periodization models don't exist. What you are referring to is what we call evidence-based practice. That's what periodization is, right? We're saying, are you doing things to get you or your athletes or yourself to where you want to go in the timeline that you want to do, using like the scientific resources available, as well as your own data collections and anecdotes, and putting all those together. That's evidence-based practice. That's periodization. There's no like this model, that model. That's all just like craziness that it's made its way into kind of like the mainstream terminology, but it's meaningless. That's the thing. So and I'm not trying to bash any of you guys asking this question. What I'm just trying to illustrate is like, these things are meaningless, and they're just meant to be like, to get you to look up Louis Simmons articles and stuff like that. Really what you want to find out is like, what is evidence-based practice? What are the modern ways of altering your training over time to get what you want? That's periodization. Periodization is synonymous with evidence-based practice. It's not synonymous with like these other silly models and like conjugate methods and all this bullshit.
Yep. Last one for the day coming up is, James, just put this in your find because there's no way you're going to find it.
All right.
CHILU.
Oh,
there he is.
Oh,
Sai Chilukuri.
God damn.
Sai says, my understanding of dynamic double progression is that you try to hit some rep target, and if it is hit, then you can increase load. There are typically 3 methods of testing this rep target that I'm aware of. First method is first set as many reps as possible. Second method is last set as many reps as possible. Third is some rep target on every working set that is not necessarily RP10. Which method do you recommend? 3 by a long shot. I'll tell you why. Biggest problem with first set AMRAP is that shit is hard as fuck. And if you do it every day and you're training or every week, then you just, stimulus to fatigue ratio sucks. Last set AMRAP is tough because you're not regulating for how many sets you did before. In a good progression system, volume will be variable week to week, and you look after 5 sets versus after 3 sets, you're getting a different number of reps, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're weaker or stronger. And then number 3 is some rep target on every working set you should already have, not necessarily RP10, which you should already be doing. And then towards the end of a progression, towards the end of a mesocycle, if you really start to leave your rep range behind, and all the sets, or at least first few, then you know to either increase that load now or wait until the next mesocycle to increase the load and do another rep progression. So that would be my best answer, James.
Yeah. And so like, I can understand why something like if you see like dynamic double progression, like it sounds cool, right? Yeah. But it's getting you to like focus on things that are maybe superfluous or just not like, so let's just say you picked option 1. To me, the first thing, aside from the like just being very fatiguing and hard, is like that's your injury risk is going to be through the roof. You're making a max effort when you're the most fresh, like on everything that you, every exercise, every session. That's nuts. That's a recipe for getting hurt, I'm telling you. Last set, it's just meaningless at that point. You have no idea. So yeah, I mean, like it's what I'm trying to say is like, if you said, hey, Dr. James, Dr. Mike, what's dynamic double progression? I'd be like, that's just some shit some guy made up. I have no idea what that is. Like literally. Sure. That's just not, it's just literally like, if I was like, hey, have you used like the dildo RIR conversion? And they'd be like, well, Dr. James said dildo RIR conversion. It's just means nothing. It's just some shit I made up, right? So just keep that in mind. And I'm not criticizing you.
Like MRV.
Ouch. But anyways, all I'm saying here is like, just don't, I don't know, don't buy into like hype and like, you know.
Yeah. No, that also like struck me as like, I just wanted to answer it gingerly and be like, yeah, like, look, like you can, there's a right way to do this system, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's a fine way to do things, but there's costs and benefits. And it's kind of like naming things when they just exist in a more grand architecture of total understanding and you could be using all of it. It's like if you have options to have like mashed potatoes, rice, beans, or pasta, and you have options of meat, like, you know, chicken, fish, steak, etc., and 3 veggies, you could say like, hey, are you using the chicken rice method or the pasta steak method?
Right.
And like, there's all kinds of different options there actually you can combine, and they all have their ups and downs. So it's the same thing as conjugate versus linear versus like block, this and that. Like you should be using kind of all of them in their moderation. So is dynamic double progression or whatever a fine system to use? Totally. But there's other stuff you could be missing, like altering loads predictably or proactively altering loads that can be really cool. But yeah, to answer your question, not only is this probably the best, number 3 is the best way to use dynamic double progression, but if you use any other system of progression, number 3 is a good way to go about it. Doing AMRAPs all the time is just really fun when you're a beginner, intermediate, and when you necessarily don't really know even how to train hard. But when you start really understanding how to train hard and you get really, really strong and you get a couple bumps and bruises along the way, the AMRAPs start to seem like a real fucking stupid idea, unless you do them like maybe once a month or something. So.
Yeah, that's like the funny thing where it's like, you don't have to do AMRAPs at all. Like you could just not do it. And so like sometimes these hot words or like, you know, little trendy fad things automatically pigeonhole you into this idea of like, should I be doing AMRAPs? It's like, you don't have to do that at all. If you just have like a fundamental understanding of some basic things like the scientific principles of training, understanding, you know, basics of training volume, frequency, intensity, things like that, then you can kind of throw that stuff out the window and say like, why am I pigeonholing myself into this weird system that I don't need?
Yep, 100%. That's actually true for a lot of different sciences. Like, you know, it used to be like there was this thing called evolutionary psychology. It's just psychology.
Yeah.
It's like, unless you don't believe our brain and mental capacities evolved, then what the fuck is wrong with you? In economics, there's like, you know, are you a classical economist, a liberal economist? Are you Keynesian? Are you an Austrian economist? It's like, well, it's just modern field of economics, and all those schools had a lot of good stuff to say. Even Marxian economics has some really excellent insights that you can use in moderation and in very specific contexts that are absolutely spot on, you know? So it's one of those things where there's naming things is cool, and it's really great to do, but eventually you have to learn the underlying principles of what's going on, and then you don't so much need as many names as you need names for specific concepts as opposed to specific methods. So that's the deal.
I absolutely agree there. Hey, Mike, economics triggered me. You're a Bjorn Lomborg fan, are you not?
Huge Bjorn Lomborg fan.
So I just read his one of his more recent books. I think it was
Which one?
I read Cool It, but I think the new one is False Alarm.
Yeah.
That was really good. But anyways, the reason that came up was because he was on JP's podcast and they had an interesting talk. So check that out if you have some free time.
I love when I post the Bjorn Lomborg reference on my Facebook every now and again. I used to, and like psycho leftists come out of the woodwork and they're like, he's wrong, he's an idiot, he's dumb. And I'm like, okay, can you explain to me logically why he's wrong? And they just never can.
Dude,
they're like, well,
okay,
misinterpreting the data. And you're like which data specifically? He uses IPCC models exclusively. And they're like, he's just not crazy and doesn't think the world is going to end tomorrow, but he's just really reasonable and uses trade-offs as the only person asking what proposals cost versus just what they propose to benefit. And it's just like, dude, if you disagree with Bjorn Lomborg at the margins, great. But as a major philosophical disagreement, you're just not a logical person, and there's not much else to say.
So there was like a really funny point in their podcast. So like what JP was saying was like, so you're presenting this like model of saying like, can we measure like the input outputs economically of all these decisions? And he's like, there's some flaws in that thinking, but he's like, here's the thing. If you want to criticize that particular analysis, you got to come up with something better. And JP spent like the good part of like an hour trying to critique that, like a really hard nose, like, okay, I'm trying to pick apart the way that you're trying to describe these decisions. And he literally was just like, I really can't think of anything better. So the burden is on you to come up with something better if you want to be a hater on it. Right. And he was just like, for now, this is like the best that we can come up with. And it was a really interesting talk.
Well, it's also like, gee, he doesn't economically and compassionately inputted cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, it's like,
how do you beat that? I mean, like, what else are you plugging? Because basically, just for those of you who are not in the know, and you can look up Bjorn Lomborg. He's got some great short videos, a couple TED Talks. He's basically a guy where, like, there's two main camps that make the most noise in global warming. Specifically, he's written a lot about other environmental issues. Camp one is like, hey man, global warming is a 5G Bill Gates fucking invention, white power. And you're like, oh, I knew that I was going with that. And then the other camp was like, we're gonna die, Greta Thunberg, fucking let's deindustrialize and everyone's gonna fucking die. And the global warming starts tomorrow and the earth is gonna burn up. Mel Gibson movie. And then in the middle is Bjorn Lomborg, somewhere between those 2 points, saying, hey guys, like, man-made global warming is almost certainly real, and it definitely has downsides that can be measured in human cost and a variety of other costs and economic costs. So, like, if we want to fix them, how much will it cost to fix them? And then let's evaluate all these policy proposals like the Paris Accords, the Kyoto Protocol, and see how much they're going to fix versus how much they cost. And a few of them, it's like the total expense of global warming over the next 100 years is like, like something like 10 trillion. And some of these programs cost like 300 trillion. Yeah. And you're like, okay, explain to me how that's a good idea. Like, we literally get the same benefit for like in 2 orders of magnitude more cost. And it's kind of like, the people that respond to that are never like mathematically responding. They're usually like, well, you just don't think the world is going to fucking end. And he's like, no, I think that's a low probability event. Like the International Panel on Climate Change continues to say every single time. So it's like it's like an exercise scientist talking to like a psycho gym bro or like a hippie who thinks your weights are going to kill you. It's like, well, let's look at the data and let's look at the trade-offs and make a logical decision. And Bjorn Lomborg, it's just funny because people try to paint him as like a right-wing conspiracy nut.
Right. He gets clumped in with them for some reason. Yeah.
Like he was living in the United States. He would exclusively vote for the Democratic Party. He's from fucking Denmark and he's openly gay. Like, boy, oh boy, that's a fucking Klan member if I've ever seen one. So It's one of those like inconvenient people. Talk about inconvenient truths. It's inconvenient for the psycho environmentalist left. And the psycho right doesn't see him because he admits that global warming is probably man-made in large capacity and that we should be doing something reasonable about it. And those people are like, reasonable about my freedom, man. And then all of a sudden no one's thinking. So check out Bjorn Lomborg. He's fucking great. And
if you guys want to see some like funny, I say funny, I don't mean them. They are funny. You get a laugh.
Funny.
Well, it's like, it's I did actually haha, but that's because I'm a bad person. But anyways, So on Cool It and in False Alarm, the two that really struck me was when he talked about the deaths of polar bears, and like I don't want to spoil that part was like fucking hilarious, and you'll see why if you read it. And then the global warming effect on human deaths, which I don't want to spoil it, is also hilarious when you actually read the statistics and stuff. So anyways, sorry for the tangent there, but when Mike was talking about economics, that triggered me.
Yeah. No, and like one of the awesome things Bjorn Lomborg does, which is great in any field, and this is something that in our field, a couple people stand out as doing really, really well. Menno Henselmans does this really well in our field, and Eric Trexler and Greg Knuckles do it really well. People just take certain things for granted because people repeat them enough, and Menno and Eric and Greg, oftentimes on different sides of the aisle, will be like, is that really true? And they look into the data and they're like, that's not true at all. Or they look into it and they're like, oh, I guess that is true. Bjorn Lomborg does that incredibly well on a bunch of environmental issues and global warming specifically, because a lot of times shit you hear in the media is just designed because media is for-profit entertainment. Every single media company is a for-profit entertainment company. They're just trying to get you to watch, and they'll say shit that's not technically wrong, although it's just wrong by omission. And all of a sudden, you're not really getting the truth. Like, many of you may be under the understanding, which is completely reasonable given media exposure, that sort of stochastic or really, really hardcore crazy weather events are increasing in volatility and frequency. And the really bad and superstorms.
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Oh my God. Bjorn Lomborg's like, that's interesting. Let's look at it statistically. And he looks at it. He's like, this is not true. And there's some context in which it is true, and most context in which it's just not. And then at the end of the day, you're like, motherfuckers. Like it's like if you had a story about every shark attack, every year, like an in-depth, like CNN nightly news 1 hour special, all you would ever see is shark attack stories. You'd be like, look. Like, I know the world's a fucked up place, but we have an epidemic of shark attack. Whereas, like, the number of people statistically that are dying of shark attacks is falling all the time, first of all. And second of all the time, it's just like nothing. It's like more people die choking on toys. They're not even, they're children's toys that they try to swallow than shark attacks. They're not even children. It's totally insane. So a lot of times when you see stuff on media and you feel this like energy from the media, and I mean this like in a real hippie way, like a negative energy of like, whoa, you should be really scared of this new thing is what's hurting your children tonight at 11. You should always be really skeptical and be like, I wonder if that's really true on the net balance, what the trend is. Is it a problem that used to be worse, is declining? Is it rather stable? Is it going up? Is it even a problem at all? And a lot of times when you read books like Bjorn Lomborg's and multiple other people, Steven Pinker, et cetera, you realize like a lot of the shit you hear in media is not an outright lie, but it mispaints the world to some significant extent to seem more bombastic and shocking. And sometimes it's not the case. It's like sorry, real quick, James, and I'll shut up. Mainstream media to scientific understanding of the world is really a lot like, no offense, no one's going to be offended, is like V-Shreds is to exercise science. Like if that's where you learn your science, like my dad literally watches all the ads on all our videos, James. My dad watches all the ads, and he'll message me. He'll be like, "Hey, this V-Shreds program, is it good?" I'm like, "Geez,
you can skip those. Come on, man."
Amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. They've actually bought supplements from this Dr. Gundry guy who like says your gut's gonna kill you. They're like, we bought the supplements. I'm like, fuck. But like that's what you're getting exercise science wise. Is like that's the reality. That's what media is.
So just a quick teaser, just on the note Dr. Mike was making about the media. So like one example is the media will often report storms and how much total damage in terms of money that they elicited, right? And so one of the funny, just a funny thing in one of Bjorn's books, I don't remember which one, but he basically looks at the historical data on storms. And for the most part, with a few exceptions, the number and intensity of storms over the last couple hundred years is about the same. It's just that humans keep moving into more storm or fire prone areas. And so
with more expensive shit.
With more expensive shit. So the damage keeps going up over time. And then the news media will report that and saying look at all the money that has been spent on storm damages or wildfires or all these things. And it's like, well,
wildfires.
The incidences are the same. More people just live in wildfire areas now.
Yeah, you guys remember the California wildfire crisis? It straight up never happened. California's had statistically almost identical wildfires for the last 100 fucking years. Like they've had in the past 200, 300 years ago, by the archaeological record or whatever, California had wildfires that make today's fires look like nothing. Like fucking cataclysmic shit. It's just fucking California. It's just now people live in the middle of fucking nowhere. They have a little house and the fire predictably comes every fucking year. They're like, oh no, our possessions. And it's like, oh, right on, man. Like, if you ever see housing in Miami, you're like, your house is at sea level. And they're like, yep. Like, what's going to happen when the next hurricane comes? You're like, I'm going to be interviewed on CNN and say how this is a tragedy. And you're like, so it is. Yeah. So it is.
Yeah. So check. We should get some kickbacks here for plugging Bjorn.
Welcome, Bjorn.
Yeah. Check that out. He also has his on audios, which is how I listen.
Oh,
listen
super.
To them,
Yeah.
All right. How'd we do on questions? Are we done?
We're done. We've been done. We actually hit 11 today because we had those 2 periodization questions, and I want to make sure we sort of like set the record straight on that.
Okay. Well, let's do our little housekeeping and we'll close out. So somebody asked I didn't address it while we were on this, but somebody asked about the law enforcement thing I was working on. I just broke the ice on that. So, like when, if any of you have tried writing before, usually you sit on an idea for maybe a year or two and you have all these other ideas and you're like, I know how this is going to come out, and you just got to fucking start at some point. And that's where I'm at now. So I just started. So that's going to be on the way probably in a couple of years. My book is still being worked on by Mel, but Charlie got the cover art done and I think it looks really good. I'm going to send the figures off to what's his name to get those worked on. So on our way, but it's going to be a minute. Dr. Mike, you got anything?
The guy from the Philippines, you mean?
Antonius, is that his name?
Yeah. We have this guy who does our graphic design for RP who lives in the Philippines, and he's on a completely different reverse time schedule than we are. So like one of our people that's in charge of this is like, Antonius is like a magic production machine. He's a genie because we send him things at 6 p.m. and then things not nonsense, things that should take like 5 days. And the next morning at 8 a.m., you use your inbox of all the things completed. And you're like, do you not sleep? What time is your night? And how do you do this so quick? It's unbelievable. International trade is unbelievable. It's just hyper talented people just everywhere in the world. And like somehow he works for us. And like, we pay him what by Philippine standards is a fucking inordinate amount of money, which he more than fucking deserves because he's a freak. I understand how he does. Nobody understands how he does it. It's going to be really, really unpalatable when you realize he employs like a team of 10 chained children to do the artwork. Oh boy, the backpedal out of that one, Nike style.
It's like, it's not a sweatshop because they're all like on tablets with like,
It's air conditioned, but they can't leave.
They're chained to the tablet.
Jesus Christ. That sounds like a really...
This episode is ending on we're just spiraling here.
I'll make it not as bad, but the artist Banksy, James, you familiar?
Yes, the graffiti person.
Yeah. So like I've in Steven Pinker's book Blank Slate, there's they cite a couple of sources for this opinions, and one of them is like I think a journalist named Adam Gopnik, I believe, and they talk about postmodern art, and they bring up Banksy as one example, and like Banksy's shit is always like a nuclear reactor and the kid playing with sand in the foreground with the gas mask on. And like one of the critiques I think by Adam Gopnik was like, this is like wildly obvious shit that's not controversial. Like, wait, does this painting mean pollution is bad? And it's like, like holy fuck. Oh my God. So it's one of those, like I could see Banksy making a thing where like we're on our iPad, but we're like handcuffed to it. And it's like, wait, hold up. Does this mean like the iPad's addicting? He's like, yeah, like bro.
Oh my God.
How did you know this? And how were you so able to put it in art? This is some high level shit. Fuck Einstein. Banksy.
Those algorithms are literally made it to be as like addicting as possible, folks. They just feeding you what you want. Technology. It's amazing.
It's amazing, except it's bad somehow.
Yeah. Yes, all right. Dr. Mike, any RP updates, personal updates? What you got? Anything?
Only internal top secret stuff that we're always working on internally and top secret. I'm no longer working on any public projects at RP that I can talk about. It's just all top secret shit. But we're cranking out the YouTubes. And in late August, we have an RP live streamed webinar super conference. And if you guys want to sign up for it, go to the RP Strength or Renaissance Periodization website. Early bird tickets are all gone. But now the regular tickets are there, and get in. It's going to be exclusive content, not just myself blabbing, not just James, but tons of other coaches too. And it's a good time. And then you get to ask Q&A and all this other shit. So if you guys are interested in some more shit and you want to pay us money, remember the Dr. Mike Lamborghini Fund and the James Hoffman
Tractor Fund,
Air Trap Fund is always open for donations. So give that some thought.
All right. Well, thanks again for the great questions and tuning in, guys. Make sure you subscribe, and we will see you in 2 weeks for another Q&A. See ya.